Beneath Africa's surface lies a wealth of mineral resources of enormous value. According to the United Nations, the continent is home to about 30% of the world's mineral reserves, 12% of the world's oil, and 8% of the world's natural gas reserves. This continent also holds 40% of the world's gold and up to 90% of its chromium and platinum, both valuable metals. We've seen the demand for raw materials skyrocket, along with the demand for clean technologies, as countries all over the world are setting out to reduce carbon emissions. These minerals and metals are used in many technologies, from smartphones to wind turbines and electric car batteries. But more than 3/4 of the global production of critical raw materials used for energy comes from just 3 countries. China leads with 66% of global supply, followed by South Africa with 9% and the Democratic Republic of Congo with 5%. This concentration of resources can also lead to major issues in supply, particularly for places like Europe, which produces very little in-house. And according to the International Energy Agency, if the world meets its global climate goals and achieves net zero emissions by 2050, global demand for minerals will quadruple by 2030. Sharon, Cembi, mining expert and the managing director of Thito Mining, joins me as we look at South Africa's role in the EU's green transition. Sharon, welcome back to Business Edge. Thank you so much for joining me again.
Thank you so much for having me once again. I'm honored.
So let's start with an explanation of this sudden sort of rise, this skyrocketing, this spike we see for demand in natural resources, particularly in raw materials. Where is that coming from? What's pushing that demand, Sharon?
The first demand in raw materials is due to what we call climate change, which is the long-term changes that we are experiencing globally, from a global perspective, through environmental degradation and existential threats to the world that we are seeing. It's affecting us even at the local level, when we see flooding and all these are long-term changes. And now we are looking for we're looking towards transitioning in a just way. So looking at the socio-economic impacts. And therefore, globally, there's a demand to develop technologies that are required to fast-track this just transition into solar. And there's a huge requirement in terms of these certain critical raw materials, such as your copper and cobalt, nickel, lithium, rare earth elements, manganese, graphite. And all these critical minerals are required in terms of development of solar photovoltaic plants. So we require more of these minerals. We require them to actually develop our wind farms. We require more of these critical minerals. For electric vehicles to be manufactured, it requires these critical materials as well as battery storage facilities. So critical minerals require a higher rate of critical minerals in order, these plants and wind farms and electrical vehicles, they require a higher rate of critical
of these raw materials. So what we're seeing is that for us to be successful with the green energy transition, we need more of these raw minerals, like the ones that the EU has included on its critical raw materials list. So let's look at that, because that list is a list where the EU is going to have some dependency on China, or dependency on South Africa, and dependency as well on the Democratic Republic of Congo, and maybe any other individual country that can provide some of these. But it comes with this high supply risk, and that's, of course, the risk of disruption, which the EU has experienced with the Russia-Ukraine crisis when it comes to oil reserves. But in terms of taking advantage of this, South Africa is really poised to really take advantage of that critical demand. Has South Africa been able to do so far, particularly in a year like this one, where we've seen demand for different ones skyrocket because of the Russia-Ukraine crisis?
Yeah, I'm glad that you mentioned the numbers earlier, where you're saying China is leading at 66%. And following that is South Africa at 9%. So the big difference between us and China is very big. So there is a big perception that South Africa is a more mature destination in terms of accessing these critical raw materials because of our geology that we have, as well as the extent of mineral exploration that we have done. But following to that, there is a big call for Africa in general to invest in exploration because some of these critical raw materials have not been discovered yet. And a huge investment in mineral exploration will uncover even other leaders following China, But from the South African perspective, we had invested in just normal geoscientific mapping tools, but now looking at this perception and also the way we are perceived as a country and being a target for accessing these critical raw materials, it allows us to now invest in more advanced mapping tools that will help us to actually uncover more potential that will position us favorably.
So interesting you talk about investing in exploration and more mapping tools, but there's also a conversation about value chain addition that we need to have. So let's look at this example. The Democratic Republic of the Congo supplies about 60 to 70% of global cobalt production. But before this material can be used, it must be refined. So despite the fact that cobalt is primarily mined in the DRC, almost all of it is processed in China. So we have to ask ourselves, even with the South Africa, most industrialized economy on the continent, one of, if not the largest commodities exporter on the continent as well, has South Africa been able to unlock the value addition parts of this? We don't just want these to be mined, we want at least another part of the value chain to be done in country. So we're of course spreading the jobs, both direct and indirect, and gaining more from these minerals that come from our soil.
I think that's a very valid debate, and for resource-rich countries, in order for resource-rich countries to leverage from this, it's a potential for economic development. When these are mined, these critical minerals are mined in our countries, we are able to improve our countries. But at the same time, we have not invested in facilities that will help us to actually open up and allow us to in-house explore ways in which we can use it, internally consume it without having to rely on China to process some of these materials on our behalf. So it also calls for a reinvestment of some of these potential benefits of these minerals so that we can be able to self-sustain the continent and also our country, not only just the minerals being extracted, but the country being able to process it in-house and use it for our own purposes.
All right, Sharon, before I let you go, while we can see the opportunities ahead of us, not just for South Africa, but the DRC, but also other African countries when it comes to these raw resources, when we look at everything that's around us, there are also challenges to making this happen. We've talked about the value addition, we've talked about exploration and mapping, but beyond that, particularly for South Africa, what do you think are the challenges that possibly stand in the way of the country in fully utilizing the raw materials? So we expect to see the EU coming to South Africa with some plans, partnerships, agreements that will lock down probably certain amounts of these materials for 20 years, a decade, centuries even, or maybe generations. But what do you think are the challenges to South Africa being able to really take advantage of what it has?
Okay, so I do also see that demand may outstrip supply, but this puts also pressure on more mineral mapping, as you've mentioned, investment in technologies, and also the success factors where businesses conform to the local legislative measures. So this will improve their social license to operate, as well as adopting climate smart mining methodologies. So these are resources. This helps resource rich countries to be able to leverage on this demand and make a meaningful impact within their communities, and not being allowed to be vulnerable at that point. And also, mineral and mining legislation should be at the center so that we incorporate the sustainability aspect of our mining, where our local people are able to benefit from this economic
benefits.
Yes.
All right, Sharon Cembi, thank you so much. Mining expert and managing director of Thito Mining, joining me from Johannesburg, South Africa. It's not the end of this conversation. We know there'll be more developments as we see that demand continue to skyrocket. But I do appreciate your time today. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you.